Why? Your Bible gives you a name. 3 words. Short, confident. I am who I am. God says it to Moses at the burning bush, and you've heard it 1,000 times. Pastors quote it, tattoos carry it, theologians build entire systems on top of it. It's the kind of line that gets carved into the stone above the doors of seminaries and inked inside the covers of study Bibles. It's treated as the deepest possible answer, the name above all names, existence itself compressed into a sentence, something final, something sealed, the divine self-disclosure finished and delivered. But here's what nobody tells you when they read those 3 words out loud. The Hebrew verb behind them is not in the present tense. In fact, biblical Hebrew doesn't have a present tense at all. And when you understand what the verb actually is, what grammatical form it's in, what the form by its own definition refuses to do, the whole burning bush scene changes in a way that no English translation has ever been able to fully show you. God isn't giving Moses a philosophical definition of himself. He's doing something far stranger, far more uncomfortable, and far more theologically powerful than that. He's refusing to be pinned down, and the refusal is the revelation. The name and the unnameable are the same word, and it is a verb. The word is Ehyeh. Ehyeh. Say it out loud. Ehyeh. It's the first person singular imperfective form of the root verb hayah, hayah, the most basic Hebrew verb meaning to be, to become, to come to pass, to happen. Strong's Concordance, H1961, opens it up. Hayah means to exist, to be or become, to come into being, always emphatic, never a mere copula or auxiliary. And then comes the crucial linguistic fact. The imperfective form of a verb in biblical Hebrew does not express a completed action. It expresses an action that is ongoing, not yet resolved, open toward the future. Biblical Hebrew did not sort verbs into past, present, and future the way English does. It sorted them by aspect, by whether the action was complete or incomplete. The imperfective form is, by definition, the form of an action that hasn't finished happening yet. When God speaks the word Ehyeh to Moses, he is not speaking in the eternal philosophical present of Greek metaphysics. He is speaking a verb whose grammar points forward. The whole phrase, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, doubles this. I will be what I will be. I will become what I will become. The relative particle asher in the middle is, as BDB, the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon, defines it, a sign of relation. It connects the 2 instances of the same verb without closing the loop. The sentence starts with a verb that hasn't finished, connects to itself through a particle that signals resolution rather than resolution, and ends with the same open verb again. God says his name, mirrors it back to itself, and leaves the equation with no answer on the right-hand side. To understand what Ehyeh was carrying when God spoke it, you need to see what hayah does across the rest of the Hebrew Bible. The verb appears more than 3,500 times, and it almost never functions as a simple static copula, an English is connecting a subject to a predicate. Strong's Concordance lists its range of uses: become, accomplished, committed, come to pass, happen, follow, require. These are all active, eventful words. Hayah is the verb of things coming into being, of situations developing, of events unfolding across time. When the Spirit of God moves over the waters in Genesis 1:2, the description uses the same grammatical family. When God says to Abram in Genesis 12:2, I will make you a great nation, the verb underneath is hayah. You will become. This is not being as a stable state. This is being as arrival. This is being as event. And when Moses hears Ehyeh at the burning bush, the word carries all of that usage behind it. Every time hayah had ever said, this came to pass, in the stories Moses grew up hearing, every time it marked the arrival of something new, that weight was in the word God chose to name himself with. Not I exist, I come to pass, I arrive, I happen. The divine name is God saying, I am the kind of being who happens. I am the kind of being whose presence is always an event. Imagine you're Moses. You've been a nobody for 40 years in the desert. Before that, you were a prince in Egypt, adopted by Pharaoh's own daughter, educated in the most sophisticated court in the ancient world, trained for power. Then you killed a man. One blow. An Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And it unraveled everything. You ran. You ended up in Midian, married to the daughter of a local priest, tending sheep that don't even belong to you. 40 years. And now a bush is on fire and not burning. The fire has been burning since you first noticed it, and not one branch has turned to ash. And a voice comes from inside the fire. And the voice tells you to take off your sandals. And then it tells you to go back. Back to Egypt. Back to Pharaoh's court. Back to the most heavily armed empire in the ancient Near East, carrying a message about the liberation of 2 million enslaved people. And you say, if they ask me who sent me, what is his name? What do I tell them? And the voice says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. Tell them that. Tell them, I will be what I will be, sent you. Picture Moses standing there in the firelight, his sandals off, the heat on his face. He asked for a name he could hand to people like a credential. He got a verb. He got a verb that hasn't finished happening yet. Moses asked a completely reasonable question. In the ancient Near East, a name was not just a label. A name was a handle on reality, a way of knowing a thing's nature, its limits, its domain. To know something's name was to have access to what it was. The Egyptians understood this deeply. Their entire magical tradition was built on the power of names. Every deity had a fixed designation you could invoke in ritual, a defined domain you could appeal to. Hapi, the god of the Nile inundation. Thoth, the god of scribes and wisdom. Ra, the sun. These names were specific. They told you exactly what you were working with. The surrounding ancient world operated the same way. Baal was the storm. Mot was death. Asherah was fertility. You knew what you were praying to because the name told you. Moses needed something like that. He needed a credential, something with enough specificity that the elders of Israel and Egypt could test it against what they already knew about divine power. So he asks, and God gives him what Nahum Sarna, one of the preeminent Jewish biblical scholars of the 20th century, writing in the JPS Torah commentary, describes as a phrase that clearly evokes the name YHWH and reveals it as a verbal form. The one who causes to be, the one who is always becoming. But before God gives Moses the usable shorthand, the single word name YHWH that he specifies in verse 15 as the name for all generations, he first gives him the long form, the wild form, the grammatically untamable form, a verb instead of a noun, an action instead of a definition. Scholars like John Sanders and Terence Fretheim trace a pattern through Genesis and Exodus that almost no English reader sees because it is invisible in translation. God's characteristic promise, the one he makes to Abraham in Genesis 26:3, to Isaac in Genesis 26:24, to Jacob in Genesis 28:15, and again in Genesis 31:3, is always the same. Ehyeh imach, I will be with you. Or in the third person, YHWH is with you. The phrasing is not decoration, it is the covenantal formula. Whenever a patriarch receives a commission that is too large for them, go to a new land, don't go to Egypt, go back to your brother who wants to kill you. God's first word is the same word, Ehyeh, not here's the plan, here is who will be there. And then at Exodus 3:14, when Moses needs the same thing his ancestors needed, a reason to walk into the impossible, God does not give him a new kind of answer. He gives him the same verb that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob received, but now elevated into a name. The promise becomes the name. The presence formula becomes the divine identifier. Moses isn't receiving new theology. He's receiving the accumulated weight of every I will be with you that the patriarchs ever heard, compressed into two words. Ehyeh asher ehyeh, the name that is a promise. The promise that was always a name. Here is where most English translations have quietly done something consequential. They have flattened the imperfective aspect of Ehyeh into a philosophical present tense. I am who I am. And in doing so, they handed the verse to Greek metaphysics. Augustine read it that way. God is the eternally self-existent one, pure being without limit or dependency. Aquinas built his entire argument for divine necessity on it. God is the being who could not exist, whose essence and existence are identical. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced around the 3rd century BCE, rendered Ehyeh asher ehyeh as ego eimi hoon, I am the one who is. It's a philosophically precise statement. It's a statement Parmenides might have written. It captures something true about God, but it is not quite what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew verb does not sit still. It leans forward. It is imperfective. It is, by its own grammar, not a completed state. The RSV includes I will be what I will be in its footnotes. The Sepharia translation of Exodus 3:14 notes openly that the meaning of the phrase is uncertain, variously translated, I am that I am who I am, I will be who I will be. Modern translations hedge the verse constantly with footnotes that most pew sitters never open. Scholar Jeffrey Tigay, writing in the Jewish Study Bible, gives the phrase as, I will be what I will be, and says it means, my nature will become evident from my actions. He's reading the verb the way the verb is shaped, forward, dynamic, relational, not abstract being, becoming through action. Let me be direct about something. In the ancient Near Eastern world that Moses was standing inside, when you pressed a deity for a name, you were, whether you knew it or not, reaching for leverage. Names were the mechanism of control in the ancient magical imagination. This was not a uniquely Egyptian idea. Mesopotamian religion, Canaanite religion, the surrounding ritual cultures all operated on a version of it. If you knew the true name, you had a key. You could compel, you could bind. And God, at Exodus 3:14, gives Moses something that cannot be used that way. A A verb is not a lock. An imperfective clause has no key slot. I will be what I will be. The sentence doesn't even have a grammatical object. There is no thing you can attach to it, no ritual you can perform on it, no finite shape you can trace your fingers around. God gave Moses the only kind of name that cannot become an idol. Now go back 2 verses, Exodus 3:12. Before Moses asks for the name, before God gives it, God says something in direct response to Moses' first objection. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God says, Ki Ehyeh imach, for I will be with you. The identical verb, Ehyeh. The exact word that becomes the divine name in verse 14 is already there in verse 12 as a promise. This is not a coincidence the narrator left in by accident. Crossway biblical commentary makes it explicit. God uses the very word in verse 12 that he will use in verse 14 to name himself. And in verse 12, it is unambiguously a promise. I will be with you. The scholars who have pressed hardest into this narrative, Terence Fretheim in his Exodus commentary, John Sanders in his theological analysis, the working preacher commentary team at Luther Seminary, all arrive at the same place. Most biblical scholars today, as John Sanders writes directly, agree that in Hebrew thought the emphasis is not upon pure or abstract being, but rather the stress is upon God's presence with Moses and Israel. The name is not a metaphysical declaration, it is a relational one. I am and I will be with you are the same word. They are the same statement given in 2 different grammatical positions, once as promise, once as name. The name is the promise, repeated. The name doesn't tell Moses what God is made of. It tells Moses that what God is made of will show up. And this connection runs through the entire commission. Scholars who count the structure of Exodus 3 note that God responds to all 5 of Moses' stated objections, his 5 deferrals, his 5 reasons why he cannot possibly do this, with variations on the same verb, Ehyeh. I will be with you. I will be with your mouth. The name Moses carries into Egypt is not a static label. It's a verb that keeps walking next to him. It's the same verb stamped into his authorization credential and whispered into every moment of doubt. This is not how you use a noun. This is not how metaphysics works. This is how a presence works. Now look at verse 15. Having given Moses the long form, the doubled verb, the grammatically unclosable phrase, God gives him the short form, Yahodeh, YHWH, the tetragrammaton. 4 letters that the consensus among modern scholars reads as a third-person imperfective form of the same root, hayah. He who is. He who causes to become. He who will be. The shift from first person to third is the shift from God speaking about himself, Ehyeh, I will be, to Moses speaking of God to others, YHWH, he who is and will be. Ehyeh is what God calls himself. YHWH is what the world will call him. Both are verbs in the imperfective. Both remain open. And both carry the same grammatical refusal to be compressed into a fixed thing. God's personal name, the one that appears nearly 7,000 times in the Hebrew Bible, the one that Jewish tradition eventually stopped pronouncing aloud because of its holiness, is a verb. A verb that the grammar says has not yet finished happening. There is an ancient Jewish midrash, Exodus Rabbah 3:6, that records 6 different interpretations of Ehyeh asher Ehyeh. 6. The rabbis who compiled that collection could not settle on one reading, and one of the interpretations held there is the reading that the Greek tradition most resists, that God was being deliberately non-disclosive, not deceptive, but refusing to hand Moses a name that Moses could then use to define and thereby contain the divine. The scholar B.D. Erdmans, writing in 1948, said it directly. God was being intentionally evasive. The theologian Karl Barth pushed back hard on this. He argued that God at the burning bush is revealing, not hiding, and the narrative context of a coming liberation supports Barth's point. But here is what you notice when you hold both readings at once. They do not cancel each other. The text is doing both. God is revealing himself as the one who will act, who will be present, who will deliver, and simultaneously refusing to be given a name that could function as leverage over him. The revelation and the refusal are the same grammatical act. The imperfective verb discloses and withholds in one move. Here is the honest turn. The reading that turns Exodus 3:14 into a Greek philosophical statement about ontology, I am the eternally self-existent one, is not wrong in everything it touches. Augustine was not inventing something alien when he heard pure being in this text. The connection between Ehyeh and divine aseity, the idea that God depends on nothing outside himself for his existence, is defensible. The Septuagint translators had reasons for their choice of ego eimi ho on, but the cost of that choice is that it routes the verse through a category that the Hebrew text was not using. The Hebrew text is not making a static predication. Here is what God is. It is making a dynamic one. Here is how God moves. Scholars debate endlessly about whether I am who I am or I will be what I will be is the better rendering. What they almost never debate is whether the verb is imperfective. It is. That's the grammar. And the theology that grows from imperfective grammar is theology about presence in motion, not being at rest. My nature will become evident from my actions, Ehyeh said. That is still a form of revelation, but it is revelation that keeps moving. It will not sit for a portrait. Here's what the Septuagint translators were trying to solve. They had a Hebrew verb, Ehyeh, that has no clean Greek equivalent. Greek has the present tense. Greek loves the present tense. Aristotle built an entire metaphysics on what it means for something to simply be. And the Hebrew verb they were translating refused to simply be. It kept reaching forward. So they chose the most philosophically dense word in their arsenal, ho on, the one who is. They were trying to honor the depth of the Hebrew with the deepest available Greek. And still, every scholar who reads both languages will tell you the translation lost something. The imperfective didn't make it across. The forward lean, the not yet finished quality, that got flattened into a philosophical perfect. It happens every time you translate from one world of thought into another. You gain precision in one direction and lose it in another. This is not the translator's fault. It is the nature of the problem. And the problem has been sitting inside your Bible in English this whole time. Now, John 8:58, Jesus is in the temple courts in Jerusalem. The argument with the Pharisees about his identity escalates through an entire chapter of John until finally he says, in the Greek, Prin Abraham genesthai ego eimi. Before Abraham was, I am. Ego eimi. Present tense. Unambiguous. And the connection being drawn is real. Jesus is reaching for the divine name from Exodus 3:14. The Pharisees pick up stones to throw at him. They understand exactly what he's claiming. They've been in the same Hebrew tradition Moses was standing in. They recognize the claim immediately, and Christian theology has built rightly on this moment. But here's what gets added when you bring the Hebrew back into the room. The Septuagint translation of Exodus 3:14, the Greek text Jesus' audience would have grown up reading, renders Ehyeh asher Ehyeh as ego eimi ho on. I am the one who is. So when Jesus says ego eimi in John 8:58, he is reaching for that Septuagint phrase, which is itself a translation of the Hebrew Ehyeh. He is pointing 3 generations back, first to the Greek translation, then through the Greek to the Hebrew, then through the Hebrew to the burning bush, then through the burning bush to the verb that doesn't close. The Greek ego eimi says I am. The Hebrew Ehyeh, the source the Septuagint was translating, says I am and will be and am still becoming. And the sign that the Septuagint translators were aware of the gap between the Greek and the Hebrew is the fact that they added the word ho on, the one who is, which is itself a philosophically loaded term in Greek, borrowed from the language of Parmenides and Plato to describe eternal, unchanging being. They knew the Hebrew verb was richer than a Greek present tense. They tried to fill the gap with the deepest philosophical language available to them, and still the gap remained. Jesus points back to the burning bush. And the burning bush points to a fire that does not consume, which is, in the original Hebrew verb's grammar, precisely what the verb does. It burns without reaching completion. It is imperfective fire, a fire that, grammatically speaking, has not finished burning. What does this change for you? Not in the seminar room, not in the argument about translations, in the moments where it actually lands. Here is the particular weight of this, for anyone who has ever found themselves in a commission they did not choose. Moses had 5 objections, 5 separate attempts to get out of what he was being sent to do. And in response to every single one, the scholars count them, they are all in Exodus 3 and 4, God comes back with the same verb, Ehyeh. When Moses says, I am nobody, God says, Ehyeh imach, I will be with you. When Moses says, they won't believe me, God shows him signs but frames it with the same promise. When Moses says, I cannot speak well, God says, I will be with your mouth. The repetition is deliberate. God is not giving Moses a different reassurance for each different fear. He is giving Moses one thing, over and over, in every form the situation requires. One verb, one presence, one commitment that reshapes itself to whatever Moses needs it to be in the moment he needs it. This is what I will be what I will be looks like from the inside. It's not a philosophical abstraction about divine incomprehensibility. It's the same voice that said, I will be with you in verse 12, now saying, and I will be with you in the next thing, and the next thing, and the thing after the next thing, and in every specific shape that with you needs to take as the situation changes. Ehyeh asher ehyeh is not one promise. It is the promise that will become every promise the situation requires. Think about what that means at the level of actual lived experience. You have prayed, probably, for a specific answer, for the path that was clear enough that you could see where you were putting your feet, for the name you could carry into the situation the way Moses needed a name to carry into Egypt. And sometimes what comes back is not the specific answer. What comes back is something that feels more like a verb. Something like, I am here, I will be there. Watch and you'll see what that means. If that has ever felt like less than you needed, if you've ever held I will be with you in your hands and thought it was lighter than a plan, this is the thing to hold on to. Moses went into Egypt with exactly that, and nothing more, just the verb. And the verb, as it turned out, was sufficient for every specific thing that happened from the Red Sea to the edge of the Promised Land. Not because Moses understood what Ehyeh would do next, but because Ehyeh kept arriving. Think about the times you needed God to be specific. Needed a clear name, a plan, a map, a credential you could hold up and say, this is who is in charge of this situation. And what came back felt open-ended. What if that openness is not the absence of an answer? What if the grammar of Ehyeh asher ehyeh is the grammar of how divine presence actually works? Not like a noun you carry, but like a verb that stays next to you. Moses didn't get a map. He got a verb. He got the promise that the one who spoke from the fire would be with him in the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing that came when the thing after that went wrong. The name and the presence are the same word. Not, here is my definition. Here is, I will be there. The burning bush did not consume the wood. Moses didn't leave with a full understanding of the divine nature. He left with a verb, and the verb was enough to walk back into Egypt. Have you ever noticed how the moments where God felt most real to you were not the moments where you had the clearest theological explanation, but the ones where something showed up, where the thing you needed arrived in the form of a person, a word, a door opening, an event you couldn't have engineered? That's Ehyeh working in the wild. Not a definition, a becoming. I will be with you in this the way I showed up in the last one. The verb is the covenant. The name is the promise. And the promise is still imperfective, still not finished happening. Here is what's coming in the next video. The Hebrew word nefesh. Your Bible calls it soul. It appears more than 750 times in the Old Testament. Every major English translation has made the same choice with it. A choice that may have smuggled Greek philosophy into a Hebrew concept that has nothing to do with an immortal inner ghost. The word nefesh in the Hebrew text does something very different from what soul does in English. That's the next door. That's the next word. If this opens something for you, if the grammar of a single verb changed the way you hear this story, leave a comment below. Tell me which translation you grew up with, and whether it ever felt too small for the God it was trying to describe. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into the original language. Every video in this series takes one word, one Hebrew or Greek word, and follows it all the way to the bottom of its root. Because you've been reading a translation of a translation, it's time to read the source. There is a fire at the edge of the desert. It has been burning since before Moses arrived, and the bush is still not ash.